I want to welcome you to the 23rd episode of Silver Lining for Learning. Thank you for joining us today, or if you're watching later, thank you for taking a look at our archive. My co-hosts for today are Kurt Bonk from Indiana University and Scott McLeod from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Scott was co-host for a program about a month ago on simulation, and this is another program on simulation. The first dealt really with simulation as a vehicle for adult learning and professional capacity building, and this program is centering more on simulation for student learning. So our two guests, Ahmad Rahimi is from Florida State University, and Tina Grotzer is my colleague at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Ahmad will briefly introduce himself, then Tina will introduce herself and start to talk about her work.
Thank you so much, Chris, and everybody for having me on the show. I am a fan of the show. First of all, let me put that aside. I'm from Florida State University. I'm a PhD candidate in the Instructional Systems and Learning Technologies program there, and my advisor is Dr. Valerie Shute. That most of the things that I'm going to talk about are the things that I learned from her in the past 5 years. And I would be happy to talk about another project that I've started, again, inspired by this initiative in Iran, and I would be happy to talk about that as well.
Hi all, my name is Tina Grotzer. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I am on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm a senior researcher at Project Zero, where I run the causal learning in the classroom lab, and I also work on the EcoLearn project with Chris, as he had mentioned. I'm a cognitive scientist, and most of my work sits at the intersection of education and cognitive science. So I'm always asking, how can we really help students take the very best of their thinking and the things we know about the mind and the brain and how they work, and use them to serve learning well in the classroom. So I'm going to start today by sharing a video. It's a video of our EcoXPT project. EcoXPT was actually the third project that Chris and I endeavored to take on. And then afterwards, I'm going to tell you a little bit of the backstory of when Chris first came to me about this initiative, and it was his idea to bring our project work together. And I had some thoughts about that and some reasons why I think it was a really, really powerful and important thing to do, especially in today's climate. So I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to make sure you can hear sound. So let's do this as quickly as possible. Yep, it's already being shared. Okay, so let's go.
Experimentation is an important practice for the development of science understanding, but it can be hard to do classroom experiments to learn about ecosystems because ecosystems are complex systems in which processes are often hard to see and can take place over large scales of space and time. Immersive virtual environments can help students learn about ecosystems by situating student inquiry in a realistic context. EcoXPT is an inquiry-based middle school ecosystem science curriculum that is designed to support students in doing experimentation. It's based on an earlier immersive world called EcoMove, in which students investigate a virtual pond to figure out why all of the large fish in the pond have died. Students make observations, collect data over time, and talk to characters in the world. But in EcoXPT, they can also conduct a variety of experiments, the kinds of experiments that real ecosystem scientists do. EcoXPT includes 6 kinds of experiments and tools for going deeper into the causal relationships in the system. They include tolerance tanks to see what factors are harmful to fish, comparison tanks to set up experiments with different factors, a weather simulator to see the effects of air temperature and wind, tracers to see where fertilizer runoff goes, a sensor buoy that collects 24-hour data in the pond, and a mesocosm experiment to see the effects of sunlight and nutrients on algae. The curriculum includes thinking moves, a set of strategies to guide students while they investigate the world. These thinking moves are introduced through short videos and posters.
Let me show you the first thinking move that will be helpful. Scientists call it deep seeing. When I'm practicing deep seeing, I look closely.
Design-based research with EcoXPT looked at how students interact with the new experimental tools. For example, these students are adding chemical tracers to bags of fertilizer in order to see how the spatial layout and topography of the pond affect fertilizer runoff when it rains. The concept map tool allows students to construct a map that represents their ideas about the causal relationships in the ecosystem.
Green algae make dissolved oxygen, which is consumed by all three of the fish. And the fish,
Over the next year, we are conducting research studies of the full EcoXPT curriculum to see how it might enhance student abilities to develop sophisticated and accurate mental models for difficult science concepts, and to increase their engagement and understanding of forms of inquiry in science.
Okay, so that video is actually from 2017. Now we've actually gone beyond it, and we have done a lot of research on it, which I will share some of that with you. But first I want to tell you a little bit of the backstory. So I study how students reason about complex causalities and have been doing this for about 30 years now. So when Chris came to me in 2009 and said, I think we should bring our work together and we should think about how to create a virtual world that helps students think about ecosystem science in particular, because that was an area we were studying, I was enthusiastic, but it took me a little while to get there. And it's because I work in so many classrooms where they don't have a lot of technology. And so it's always a case of how can we leverage, what's available to teach the concepts. But the more I thought about it, I started to get really excited, because one of the issues in learning about causal complexity is that we often teach kids how to reason, but we don't help them to understand how to perceive and pay attention to the occasions to reason about it. And so the really big point of leverage for me in this work was that I would be able to see where students were perceiving and attending opportunities to reason about complex causality. So the cognitive scientists, particularly causal Bayesians, talk about this as the ontological problem. And often when they're studying how students think about causation, they do it in the lab, and they set a problem up and they ask kids to attend to it. And then they tell us what kids were able to do. Now, that's great. However, in the real world, we're walking around every day. And if we don't see an occasion and then start to reason about it, we'll never get there, right? So ability is great, but you have to also have what we refer to in the thinking literature as sensitivity to occasion. So it's a triadic notion of thinking dispositions. It's sensitivity to occasion to reason, the ability to reason, and then you have to follow through and have the inclination. EcoXPT and its earlier version, EcoMove, are problem-based scenarios. However, we don't give the problem to the kids. They have to find the problem. They have to notice it and they have to wonder about it. So it's problem finding. And so that helps us to know what's salient to them. What kinds of variables do they attend to? So EcoMove was the first version of a virtual world that we did. And the puzzle about EcoMove, as much as we loved it, the teachers, and we saw, great gains in learning, was that it was observational only. So students could see the patterns, but they couldn't intervene on the patterns. So they really couldn't develop truly causal explanations. And as we asked them to gather evidence, they did. They were very happy to jump to conclusions. They would notice that there were correlational patterns, the phosphates went up and the nitrates went up, and then the dissolved, the algae grew, and then, the algae died and the dissolved oxygen went down, and that caused the fish to die. So EcoXPT was an opportunity to create authentic experimentation and to allow the kids to intervene on these individual relationships that they could see, both individually isolated in a lab, but also out in the real world, as you saw in the video, in the ways that ecosystem scientists did. And so there we were really interested in how would they think about the causal explanations that they were creating. We also focused on the differences specifically between correlation and causation. And when you saw the thinking moves in the video, we have, there's a number of thinking moves: deep seeing, evidence seeking, but two of them, pattern seeking and analyzing causality, are specifically designed to help kids differentiate between correlational patterns and correlational relationships and causal relationships. All of those thinking moves, by the way, are aligned to next generation science standards kinds of content in this country. So we added a concept map, but that in and of itself doesn't tell you whether students see it as a causal relationship. They are very happy to make those links. So we started looking at what are the sources of evidence that they're using, and we asked them to put their evidence into the concept map. And we helped them understand that you needed to have diverse forms of evidence and that you needed to be able to think about the mechanism. So much of our scoring on EcoXPT has also been looking for mechanism information. So do they intervene? Do they have experimental data? And do they understand the mechanism? So in our studies of EcoXPT, so that video, as I said, was from 2017. So now we have tested EcoXPT in the classroom with 2,000 students, a little over 2,000 students, and we've run a number of kinds of tests. One of them is we compared, this is one of the wonderful things about virtual worlds, we compared what happens if you have the entire multi-user virtual environment, the immersive world, but without the experimental tools, to that world with the tools. And we had a back end button that we could turn it on and off. And what we saw is that both groups made significant gains in understanding ecosystems content, the dynamics across space and time, and experimental methods and attitudes towards science, but that those with the experimental tools demonstrated significantly greater understanding of the experimental tools and the differences between correlation and causation in particular. We also contrasted it to a program called Environmental Detectives. So Environmental Detectives is a paper-based version focused on the very same issues, the same kinds of environmental dynamics and issues, and has the same environmental problem at its core. And in this case, the EcoXPT students made the gains, as they did as the earlier ones I mentioned in attitudes towards science, experimental methods, correlation, causation. The kids in the Environmental Detectives version only made significant gains in attitudes towards science. So they liked it, that was great. Teachers liked it too. And then they saw the test results and the differences between them. We also ran some case studies. We looked at how EcoXPT compared to other technology-based programs and found that EcoXPT was especially helpful at supporting students in understanding the complex dynamics of ecosystems and in focusing on explanations that had bodies of evidence. So we interviewed ecosystem scientists to talk to them about how they think about establishing a causal explanation. And there's a paper that we published in Bioscience. This was Amy Kamranen and I. So when I'm speaking of the work of a team, of course. So Amy Kamranen, and you heard Sherry Metcalf's voice in the video. So we published that version, and then we went back into the classroom and said, what would happen if we really encouraged kids to think about bodies of evidence? So one of our case studies was just that. And what we saw is that the kids who had the focus on bodies of evidence really had, they made fewer connections, but the connections were very well supported. They were judicious about making their connections. They didn't willy-nilly just, connect everything up in the ecosystem. Teachers like to say, well, all things are connected. Well, that's true in some sense in a global way, but if you're coming up with a causal explanation, you need to think about the mechanism behind it and how you're making those connections. And finally, I just want to say a brief bit about the era of COVID. So one of the really interesting things, I do a lot of work with schools, and I've been working with a lot of schools, helping them think about what to do this September. But COVID has really pushed a lot of teachers towards seeing the deep value in self-directed learning. And so, EcoXPT is a fabulous way to induct teachers into feeling comfortable with that. So we have put EcoXPT into classrooms where kids are, into their homes where kids are working with EcoXPT, and then the teacher will have a Zoom session with them to talk about what they're figuring out. She can see their screens. They can send screenshots of what they're figuring out to her. They can let her know if they're really stuck. But it kind of encourages the bit of hands off that you need for good, productive struggle. And then if they're struggling unproductively, they'll reach out, and there are ways that teachers can reach out to them. I ran such a group this summer. It was great fun. And, I think there's some puzzles about it because we're trying to figure out the question. Chris and I are thinking about how do we make it available to more students, because you do have to have an internet connection. Well, you don't have to have an internet connection once you're working on it. We have an offline version, but you have to be able to get the program, download it, and then get started in it. And it runs right now on PCs and Macs. So I think that's all I'm going to say for now. I hope that's enough. Invite my colleague Ahmad to follow.
Let's just give a chance for a couple questions. Mm-hmm. And I just want to build on what Tina said about the pandemic. People are wringing their hands because they feel that students have moved from the rich environment of the classroom to the impoverished environment of the home. But if you look at something like this, they've moved from the impoverished environment of the classroom to the impoverished environment of the home. And they're saying, well, kids at home can't have a rich social interaction. Well, they can if we use simulations and other kinds of learning by doing in which collaboration is structured. So there's this kind of nostalgic worship of the classroom environment that I think is misplaced in a lot of ways. And I hope one of the things we carry away, if we can get to doing remote learning that really is sophisticated, is an understanding that non-digital classrooms are very impoverished places in many ways. So Kurt, Scott, do you have questions, comments?
Well, a couple things. You've got a history here. You've done several iterations. And so the first part of my question is, what kinds of things have you discovered that if you had known early on in the first iteration, you would have immediately put into the system? What features and tools and what pedagogical activities marry with those? And so that's one thing that I'm interested in you exploring a little bit, because the concept maps are cool feature. When do they get placed in the system? When do students find out about them? Is that a late end aspect of it? Is it an early end? Are there tools and features that come into play earlier than others to get at productive struggles? And then are those productive struggles more apparent and more valuable now that we're placed in COVID environments? Are you getting yourself, are you seeing a renewal in your energy for doing research because the constraints have changed and you're testing the system out in different environments what it was originally built for? So it's a two-part question.
Sure. So the first part of it is that there are tools that are stepped in EcoXPT. So the kids first they're just exploring. They don't really know why they're there, and we don't have them time. So you can time travel. We don't have them time travel in the first day. We let them get familiar with the spatial terrain. And then a few days in, we start to invite them to time travel. And then we start to add the experimental tools around day 6. This curriculum runs about 12 to 15 days. And so kids have time to really explore. One of the really interesting things in it is that they will notice things early on observationally that they don't know the importance of, and then later will say, oh, I noticed that the water was getting greener, right? And there was a dog walker who talked about it. But they are taking notes all the way through. And this, mimics what an ecosystem scientist would do. So they are, writing down, I noticed the water's getting greener. I noticed that there seem to be fewer fish. I noticed that the bigger fish are swimming closer to the surface. So they might take notes like that into their online notebook. Those later get pulled into the concept map as forms of evidence. There's various forms of evidence, including testimony, experimentation, observations, and correlational patterns. And then they're starting to explore those patterns. They have charts and graphs to explore them. So your question about, what would we have added if we had known? So we did add a lot of it for EcoXPT, and we're trying to be careful not to, put everything but the kitchen sink in, because you can do that too, right?
There's that thing about what features, you get feature focused.
Yes.
And then, it's one thing after, I got this idea. Oh, let's add that in. Oh, I got this idea, right? So,
right.
How do you constrain yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. We did create a bigger world with EcoXPT, and part of the reason we did that is because, one of the things I study is called action at an attentional distance. So, in cause and effect learning, often we have two things in the same attentional space, and we notice that this one impacts that one. And there's, research in very early childhood showing that kids start to put together that if this hits that, that's the beginning of physical causation. And then they wonder about things like shadows on the wall, because these two things are happening and they're moving at the same time, but they're not touching, right? So if you move the wall and not the shadow, that doesn't surprise them so much because they expect that. But if you move the object and not the wall, they don't get that, right? So that's early action at a distance. So what we have in an ecosystem is action at an attentional distance. So if I'm sitting here, I don't see what's happening in the broader ecosystem, in the broader environment. I don't see climate change influences. I don't know what's happening to polar bears. So one of the things we did is we made EcoXPT larger, so it was a larger world. As a researcher, one of the puzzles about that is that it's not the same to take your fingers and travel up to, the golf course on the other side or the farm than it is to have to go on a bus to the western suburbs. So that's one of the things that we did as far as, the things I'm most excited about around causality. And then the other piece had to do with this big piece around correlation and causation. I think if we were going to do more, and I've written grant proposals about this and we haven't quite gotten anyone. I'm not sure if we're wording the problem in a way that people are understanding it well, but I would like to be able to do some of the kinds of back-end assessment to collect the data to know what kids are attending to and what they're missing from the very start. So we can code for certain kinds of behaviors in the log file data, but I want to know what variables just go over their heads. We have
I'm gonna, for reasons of time, I'm gonna jump in.
Absolutely.
But also, this is a beautiful segue to Ahmad and his work, which deals a lot with back-end data. So Ahmad, why don't you show your work and talk about it?
Sure. Before I share my screen, let me give you a little bit of history, as Kurt mentioned. There is a 10-year history about physics playground and self-assessment work that Dr. Shute has been working on in Florida State University and with her team. It started from the first grant that she got from Gates Foundation and started creating this game called Physics Playground. which is a 2D game. And the goal in this game is to hit a balloon with a ball by drawing objects on the screen or manipulating some parameters in the game environment. And so there were several versions of the game, desktop version, and now we have a dynamic web-based version of the game in which we have a stealth assessment of physics understanding. Many other constructs have been assessed using Physics Playground, like creativity, problem solving, collaboration, and so many others. But let me now share the screen and show you a short video about our game. Before I continue, I want to take this moment and recognize the team of Physics Playground that I've been working with in the past 5 years and learned a lot from. There are 3 research teams that are working on several projects around Physics Playground from Florida State University, University of Pennsylvania, and University of Colorado Boulder. And especially I want to thank my advisor, Dr. Valerie Shute, for all of the things that she taught me these years. So stealth assessment is a term that Dr. Shute coined in 2005 to refer to a special evidence-based formative assessment, which is ubiquitous, ongoing, unobtrusive kind of assessment that is embedded into the fabric of a digital game or any other immersive environments, learning environments, to assess and support all sorts of knowledge, skills, and other attributes learning for students. As you can see here, first students are immersed in the game environment and produce all sorts of rich data, which is automatically logged into the log files and then analyzed using the stealth assessment machinery. And then after that, the student model gets updated, and that can be used as the basis for the decisions that can be made in the game. For example, the game can be adaptive, providing different challenges for the students, or different type of supports can be delivered for students with different levels of proficiency regarding the thing that you are, or the construct that you are assessing in the game. And this can continue, and the more students provide data, the more accurate the estimates of their understanding or the level of competency will be in the game. Stealth assessment is using ECD, Evidence-Centered Design Framework of Assessment, which has 3 main models: competency model, evidence model, and task model. In the competency model, we operationalize what is it that we want to assess, and with grain sizes, like not just one big construct, with all of the aspects of that construct. And then in the evidence model, we are looking at what are the behaviors that can give us some evidence for the competency that we want to assess. And finally, in the task model, we are looking at and specify the tasks, or in this case, the game levels and their features that can elicit that type of evidence that we need for the evidence model. Going from left to right, you can design assessment or self-assessment, and going from right to left, you can get diagnostic inferences about students' competencies. In the example of physics playground, this is just to show you that when this wants to be implemented in the game, there are so many different pieces that need to work together to make that possible, to make that ongoing, unobtrusive assessment possible. In our case, in Physics Playground, we have two different servers that can host the game engine on the left and the assessment engine on the right. And the data can go to the assessment engine, gets analyzed and come back to the game. As you can see in the orange part, adaptive algorithm can choose the next level for the players to play, and many other things can be happening depending on what actually you want to do with the assessment that you've done. So with this, I think I can answer some questions about our work, but before that, I want to mention that there have been so many research studies so far using Physics Playground, and recently we have done a big study including 283 students, and we compared different versions of the game. One version was adaptive, the other version was linear, and free choice that the students could choose the next level to play, and a control group. And we found evidence again for the validity of our assessment, and also the effectiveness of the learning supports that we included in the game. You're muted, Chris.
Scott, do you have a question or comment about this?
Yeah, I absolutely do. So Ahmad and Tina, I'm not an instructional technology faculty member, I'm a school leadership faculty member, and I spend a lot of time thinking about systems and implementation structures and scalability and so on. And so I've been a big fan of learning games, serious games, social impact games, simulations, like all the things that seem to be really powerful learning tools for students for a really long time. And I see my learning technologies colleagues all around the country make really neat stuff, like the stuff that the two of you were talking about, right? But it never seems to scale, right? Like it never, like, if you look at schools across the country, most students are not getting regular, frequent, thoughtful opportunities to immerse themselves in these digitally rich learning spaces, right? And so I guess my two-part question is, how do we try to get these kinds of tools out of the small research studies that are approved by NSF and out into the world of practice so that kids can actually use them at scale, right? And then simultaneously is, maybe you can speak a little bit about, what kind of training do educators need to implement these kind of rich simulations well in their classrooms? Because otherwise, I mean, kids can move sliders and push buttons and type numbers in, but not really understanding the conceptual stuff that we want them to learn, right? Without some really good instructional supports around that work, right? So, I love that Tina was talking about kids start in an inquiry stance and then move into a more sort of structured, guided pathway. But teachers are going to need help learning how to do that, right? Like they also aren't familiar with simulations and don't know how to do this work. So how do we scale up and get them out of these small research studies and into the wild so that people can use them? And what have we learned about what kind of skill sets teachers need to make it happen?
A great question. First of all, I think it's important to look at research as a way that we are kind of looking into the future by our research, and kind of getting to understand what are the things that can work best, and then we use them in the classrooms. So I see the research that we have been working on as something that can be used in the near future. But when you look at the history of our work, we first started to think about how we can implement the assessment that we are looking at, like using the self-assessment for physics understanding into the game, and how to make a valid and reliable assessment first into the game. And using lots of studies, Dr. Schutt and her team came up with the assessment that they needed. Then the next step was to provide learning supports into the game. And we spent the past couple of years, carefully designing different types of learning supports, and then going through different studies to find out which learning support can work best. And now I think yes, you have a question?
So Ahmad, if I can just pause you right there for a minute and just note that that's all really good, solid research work, and you want to make sure your tool works the way it wants, but it's also slow, right? And,
yes.
and in the meantime, nobody has access to that. And I'm also struck by the fact that you're designing on design platforms that may become 4, 5, 6, 7 years old by the time you think it's ready for actual use by students and teachers. And by then it feels old too. Yes,
Right.
no?
So first of all, it's an ongoing process, and we have our game available publicly available. Like we have our website, we have the username and password there, and people can go and play the game. But we are kind of in. I do understand that the point that these games should be used, and if not, what's the point? The process is. In a way that we really need to find out, figure out these things, like how do we want to put them into classrooms? I don't see, from our perspective, like if you want to make a change in our game, you don't need to know any programming. Like we are writing the game in a way that a teacher can use it easily. For example, the game levels can be changed in any time. You can create a game level, a game playground, and give it to a sort of group of students, and they can go and play. And you can create a different type of physics playground game with different levels for another group of students without writing any codes. And that's something that doesn't need any training for the teachers. It can be done in a half a day. So I'm saying that we as researchers are thinking also about the things that should be done in order to make teachers actually, first of all, like our game, because we need to give them some data that our game works. And that's coming from our research that we have done in the past. But I think we are not still there to, with a lot of confidence, give the tool right there to the teachers to use. I think these are kind of research quality products that need to be worked on a little bit more in order to be able to use in classrooms in the future.
So
I'd like to jump in on that if I may,
Yeah.
Scott. So I was a classroom teacher for 15 years, and I also had for a while ran a resource room where I was trying to get innovations out to teachers. So, teachers invest a lot in their instructional design and their programming, so it's really hard to get them to shift. And it's one of the reasons why COVID, is a silver lining for learning. There are some things that have made it in, like the PhET simulations. I see those in all sorts of classrooms. Teachers need good models. They need to see what's possible, but I think it can't be driven only by teachers. So that's why this shift, self-directed learning, is so important. So I have had teachers watch kids playing Kerbal Space Program and seeing the physics they're playing with, how they're talking about it, how they're going after the vocabulary words, the concepts that they want to learn. When they see kids doing this and they see that it maps directly to the goals that they have for those learners, they start to get excited. But there has to be a way to get their attention and get them to see it. And I do think that COVID has given us that opportunity. I was really feeling pretty pessimistic, after all these years in education and trying to get these wonderful innovations out there. And now the number of teachers who are turning around and saying, can we get more of self-directed learning? I'll just add that one of my students this past spring did interviews with teachers all over the country and wrote it up. And she interviewed about 30 teachers, and they said they were all talking about self-directed learning. They were not talking about self-directed learning in the fall. This was new. So I do think that it has put some of the agency back into the students' hands, the learners' hands, and that's really important. And then I think models are really important, helping teachers see it in action. We do a lot of our work in what we call pastors' quadrants, that design-based research with the teachers. So you're seeing classroom examples as we're getting them out there. And I'm sure, Val and Ahmad are doing that too. But I think it's getting teachers to realize what's possible.
So I agree completely with what Tina said. And there is hope. we're climbing out a little bit at least from the dead hand of the past and the constraint mentality of the present. But again, I'm going to do a segue from Tina to Ahmad, because Ahmad, I'd like you to talk about the initiative in Iran.
Sure. I can share my screen again and talk about the project. So this project that I started in Iran, again, started from a conversation that I had with Chris back in March. I think it was the last time that Harvard had its classes face-to-face, and after that it went to online classes. Getting inspired by the work that you guys have been doing and many others around the world, I started thinking about a project that I can be helpful in Iran in this situation. And first I thought about like coming up with a 3 to 5 pages document for teachers and explaining some things that they can use and get themselves ahead in this emergency-like situation. But I asked my friends in Iran, those that I knew and I was in contact with, to help me, and about 19 of them showed up, and we created a group and started to pitching in different things that can be useful for a teacher in this time. So we came up with a 32 pages document. We called it kind of emergency remote teaching during the COVID-19 pandemic, a first aid kit. And there were 4 different parts in this package. Key points about classroom management, class management, and resource management, and so many other things, like how to include parents in teaching and learning process, assessment in class, formative and summative in this situation, how would you deal with that? And then we kind of mapped the other sections based on the first section. We provided some useful tools for the teachers. We had some problems over there because some of the tools are not available in Iran, that they are available in other places in the world due to the sanctions, including this very service that we are using. Zoom is not available in Iran. So we had to come up with some other alternatives for this, for the teachers. And then instructional videos, some of them actually talking about the tools that we introduced in the second section. And finally, we provided some checklists for this teachers to use and evaluate their progress. So far, we had about 13,000 direct views from that document and about 1,000 members, I checked this morning, in our channel in the social network that we created. So after that, we decided to think about how we want to continue. So until June, we finalized the first edition. And from June until mid-September, we want to continue. We actually continued providing some new information and learning content for the teachers, picking a model of informal learning and micro learning in our channel. We provide some videos that are short, like 3 minutes, explaining a very simple concept about how to create content. And before we start the second phase of our project, we collected some data from teachers. We asked them what went wrong for you and what experiences you had that you can share with others that you think were successful. And based on that, we focused on content development. So teachers said, we really need help with content development. Most of the teachers in Iran are used to face-to-face teaching, and they've never had an online teaching experience. So they're kind of struggling in that regard. After September, we want to create the second edition of our package, and then we want to share it with the teachers and kind of get their, stay connected with them and get feedback from them and help them in any way that we can. I can kind of connect this experience to the stone soup experience that Chris talked about many episodes ago. So I had a stone in my hand and I asked people, come make a soup with me. And now I think the soup is made or being made for the second time. And I hope that can be useful for the teachers. And these are the names of the people who helped me. And I really thank them. I'm not sure if they're watching this live or if they're seeing this later. This cannot be done without their help.
Well, thank you, Ahmad, and the uptake that you've gotten from teachers is fabulous, and it illustrates the point that came out earlier about the bottom-up innovation that becomes possible under these conditions. Kirk, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, but first of all, I just want to say I'm getting attacked by birds out here. It's real ecosystem. You know, they're trying to get on the show. They're so loud. You can see the forest. But anyways, the second thing I'd quickly, I was reading Val Schutz's work when I was in grad school, so I'm glad to see she's, you know, continues to work in this area, and she is the right one to look to for looking at the history of this field. So Ahmad, I applaud you for having a chance to work with her, and now Chris and Tina and others. It's a great mentoring that you've had over your career, I must say. And I think she had Smithtown was the thing that I read from Valerie Schutz back in the day, in the late 80s.
I can say that when I look at her page of publications, I see her first publication in the year that I was born, 1983. So
she's amazing. This Chris is amazing too, and everyone else here. There's some tensions that I want to get at, whether it's Tina or Ahmad. You know, we've got the tension of usability testing versus getting it out, and just you know, with the limited monies that we have. We have a tension in the scalability and getting to the most common denominator, whether it's our mobile devices, or pushing deep into one format or one technology that you know, the platform issue. And then we got the tension of assessment. You know, a couple of my studies, kids said, as soon as I'm being assessed, I don't want anything to do with it. If they got a hint that they're going to be assessed, they're not going to play anymore. So assessment versus play, and how do you know, the stealth assessment, how do they know that they're being assessed? And then we have the tension of theory and pedagogy versus toolness. You know, and we've always had that, and finally, with two other ones, Punya brought up in the chat window in YouTube, people are bringing up the tension between time and 50 minutes and having lots of time and extended time now during COVID at home, just, you know, trying things out and so forth. And the final one is the difference between a guided discovery approach and the self-directed approach. Is the self-directedness that you're talking about guided still? And to what degree is it guided? So there are different tensions. Would you like to address any of them?
If I can jump for the assessment part, something that I really was thinking about to talk about in this session is the idea of assessment and formative assessment, or assessment for learning, and why self-assessment or such you know, ways of assessment can be really things that we can look at in the future of education are important. So first of all, the point that you mentioned is really interesting. Like the moment you hear the word assessment, some people equate that with testing. That's different. Assessment is for learning. You should do something after you assess someone. And the most important thing that you do like assessment for learning is that it's kind of woven into learning process. It's not like you learn, you stop, you assess, start learning again, and then assess. It should start from the first day of you know, learning and continue with learning as you go forward. And if you look at the self-assessment, is like that. The word stealth is there because it's invisible to the students. Not that we don't want to tell them that they are being assessed, but because they are so engaged in the game and they're like having fun that they don't care about if they are being assessed. They just want to show their best, and you as a teacher or educator, you're just looking at you know, the estimates and the assessment to do something about it, or the game is going to do something about their level of proficiency, to provide some supports, to change the challenges, and to, let's say, think about a classroom. If you find out that most of your students did not understand what you were talking about, and you continue teaching the same way, there should be something wrong with the teaching. So there should be something done for the learner and for the teaching process. So in other words, formative assessments are a way to make the learning go to the goal that you are as a teacher seeking, or as the student seeking. And if you look at one of the most cited papers about formative assessment from I think Blake and William, they explain the formative assessment in this way, that the student needs to know what the goal is and what's the gap to get there, and how to get there is what you as a teacher do to provide some supports for. So when you hear the word assessment, I think if we change our mindset as everyone, all the stakeholders, students, teachers, parents, assessment is for learning, is for changing the teaching, not for just testing and then you forget about it.
So I want to jump in on is it guided? Is it self-directed? So in the world of EcoXPT, there's a lot of inherent structure that helps the learners to see, how do ecosystem scientists reason? There are mentors, there are, non-player characters in the world who are sharing with them and modeling the way that they think about things. So it's not, it's inherently Vygotskian. There's this great social surround that lets the learner stand on the shoulders of giants, people who've gone before, right? It's not this pure, you figure it out, you're on your own, kid, no structure, inquiry-based learning with no supports. And Cindy Mello-Silver has done a really great job making it clear that there's lots of inherent structure in good problem-based learning. But I think that there is a tension there between self-directed and teacher-guided that's really important to draw out, because there's just such, there are different end states, different goals that each is guided towards. So I do a lot of work on something called living curriculum. And in a living curriculum model, the goal is adaptive expertise, figuring out how, not just learning to learn, but learning the skills, how to use your mind well, how to think through a problem, how to set learning journeys or learning paths. And there are schools that I work with on this, and they don't have the time constraints that I was seeing in the chats. They actually have big blocks of time where the kids are deciding, how am I going to organize my time? I'm going to learn my math. I'm going to work on this math problem in the morning because math is something that I really do better in the morning. Or I'm so involved figuring out how to solve this problem, I'm going to do that all day and I'll get to those other things tomorrow. That's different than your teacher parsing out with a set of backward design, understanding goals and saying, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. And I'm going to assess you on it. I'm going to help you take the next step. We, hard as it is for teachers, we must plan for our obsolescence in our students' lives. If we're going to have that 60-year curriculum that Chris is talking about, we're not going out in their back pockets with them. They're going to leave our classroom. So whatever we're doing to structure learning and guide learning, we need to help them learn those pedagogical or instructional design skills. How do you embark on your own learning? How do you structure it? What kinds of moves are effective? So, I think there's this question about inquiry-based that's supported or guided and not, but also self-directed versus teacher-directed. And they both have very different purposes. One more towards classical expertise, you're going to gain this body of knowledge, and the other more towards adaptive expertise. You're really going to understand how to learn, on a lifelong learning journey.
So we need to start moving towards wrapping up, and I want to express both my gratitude to Tina and Ahmad for showing the level of sophistication that kids and teachers could have in remote learning. These are free, so this is not selling something or saying, parents, open up your wallet, see what you can do. We're getting very close to all this stuff running on mobile devices and being able to scale it as much as the society lets us. But after, decades of trying to get things into schools that are not just a little better than what schools are doing, but a lot better than what schools are doing, and seeing that not happen, this whole issue that Scott raised of how you unlock this is challenging. I feel as if when I listen to a program like this, I think about medical practice, and I try to imagine medical practice if the research community and the medical infrastructure community is based around antibiotics, and it's based around immunizations, and it's based around, modern medicine, and the practitioners are still doing 1890s medicine, one step above leeches, you know, barely sterilizing anything. And I feel as if we have that kind of disconnect in education. We literally have a century between what people are doing routinely in classrooms and a very productive century in terms of learning about the mind and learning about learning and lots of other things. And somehow how we unlock people's openness to move into the modern era is important. And the pandemic has created a silver lining, but it's still not clear whether at the end of the day we're going to be able to consolidate based on it. Thoughts?
If I may mention a quick point about the pandemic. As a programmer, when I write a code, I give it to someone to break it for me under pressure. And when the bug comes out, I should do something about it. I can't use it with bugs. I think the pandemic put pressure on our educational system, and now the bugs are out. And the question is that what we do about it. And when I say we, yeah, the researchers, educators, but most importantly, those people who have power, who have money, who can direct attention to things that are important in education. For example, formative assessments or things that we can do using like these kind of sophisticated assessments that we can do now. So in the future, in the past, we could not do something like a self-assessment because we didn't have the technology, we didn't have the knowledge for it. It can be done now and it's scalable. We can have lots of students playing with the game and assessing them at the same time and providing information that they need, individualized information for them. I want to quickly bring the name of Anders Ericsson, who is an expert on experts in the world who passed away, I think 2 months ago. And he's also from Florida State University. For so long, I've been heard that practice makes perfect. But he says, no, naive practice does not make perfect. You should purposefully practice or you should deliberately practice. The difference between naive practice and deliberate practice is diagnostic assessment and feedback. So I'm saying that that's very important for our educational systems as well, to include such assessments in our systems. I don't think that globally we have the level of attention that it's needed for such assessments in our educational systems.
Tina, do you have a closing thought?
Just that I hope that our new normal doesn't bring us to a point of retreat. I think that we have exposed new possibilities, and it through a lot of pain. And that pain, I hope we haven't gone through it for nothing. And I do think that we can keep the bar raised if we can get models out there for teachers to see. I have a somewhat different leaning than you do, Chris, about the nature of education. I think that there are educators who probably shouldn't be in the classroom any longer. And I think there's a lot of great things happening in classrooms around the world. But I think that we can raise the bar when we bring technology to bear and the many, the diagnostic kinds of stance that, Ahmad is talking about, and, just new ways of doing things. And I think that really good teachers around the world will see the promise if they see the actual models and the assessments and have an opportunity to not be threatened by them, but to play with them and use them and say, wow, look what I just figured out. One of the greatest things about bringing EcoXPT into classrooms is seeing how it shifts the way teachers think about their practice. They are no longer happy with the things that they were doing before when they see what's possible. And they start asking, what else is like this out there? And how can I start to shift what I'm doing to be more like this? They do see the power in it. So I think that's the silver lining for me.
The ultimate compliment, right?
And our goal is to use these episodes as ways of exposing people to these new ideas and hoping that they not just listen, but they run with them and they improve on them. So is someone going to talk about our next episode? Scott?
I am. So as schools have returned to online remote instruction, again, in this new season of schooling, there has been one person's name that I have heard more often than anybody else's on the lips of P12 educators all around the globe. And that name is Dr. Catlin Tucker, guru of all things online and blended learning. And she makes incredible resources available for free on her website. She works directly with educators all around the world as well. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that she is going to be our guest next week to talk about practical tips and implementation strategies for hybrid and distance learning. And so really excited to have Dr. Tucker with us. Same time next week.
So Ahmad, Tina, thank you. And thanks to all of you
Thank
who
you.
are here, either directly or in the archives, and look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.